Thanks so much, everyone, for coming to join us at the self-editing tips, tricks, and tools. I'm going to share a lot of things with you tonight to help take that glorious, beautiful mess that you may or may not have created during NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month in November. We're going to talk about what first drafts are and your global and local filters. We're going to talk about point of view, verb tense, passive and active voice, weasels, bloaters, adjectives and adverbs, specificity versus generality, dialogue tags, using the find tool, and more. So first off, these are guidelines, not rules. Just like anything, there are exceptions to these tips. But Picasso had a point when he said, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. Anything that I say here, there's going to be times when you are not going to want to follow this advice. Mostly, I think that it's really important to keep consistency and moderation in mind when you are doing your editing. If you did complete NaNoWriMo or have completed a draft, congratulations. Do you realize that 90% of writers never actually finish their draft? So it's really, really impressive. You really should revel in that accomplishment and give yourself a break. You want to give yourself at least 2 weeks before editing and just really revel in that feeling. Don't skip ahead to hiring an editor, an agent, or beta readers. Don't immediately dive into publishing. Celebrate and then follow some of these tricks and see if you can't get your draft into a good shape so it's ready to go and make a good impression on whoever you share it with next. And so that you can be proud of this. Be proud anyway. It's a big deal to finish your draft. You might have heard people say that you create a shitty first draft. Another nice way to say is it's a glorious, breathtaking mess. CJ Shera, who is a great sci-fi author, she said that it's perfectly okay to write garbage as long as you edit brilliantly. And you may know Thea Puchel, who's one of our members, she calls that upcycling, which I really enjoy. Everyone has a different writing process, but many authors advise that you should write down whatever is in your mind while the spirit moves you without getting bogged down in perfecting each sentence when you're working on your first draft. So you're not going to expect that first draft to be amazing. You're laying out the bones and you add the muscle and the flesh and the great specific details through the editing piece. However, when you're working on your draft, sometimes I think that it's really helpful to polish pieces of that draft. So, chapters that you might be able to share with others so that you can feel a sense of accomplishment, get motivation to keep going, and help cure writer's block. Arthur Plotnick said that you write to communicate to the hearts and minds of others what is burning inside you. And we edit to let the fire show through the smoke. And I like to look at editing like the first draft of the story is like a block of clay with a form that hints at the beauty that can take shape after the fine sculpting of editing. When you're doing your editing, it's really important to think high level first. You need to try your best. I'm a terrible one to speak to this because I have a tendency to get bogged down in the details. It's so tempting to work on fixing all those little commas and getting your wording just perfect. Everyone does have a different method. These are some ideas that might resonate with you. Choose the one that works best for you. Keep in mind that if you do get busy on those details, it might be wasted effort. So as I mentioned, we want to start at the high level. What we do when we're doing our editing process, it's going to be like this iterative process. Expect to make at least 3 drafts is kind of one of the rules of thumb. Some people say they make even 10 drafts. That I think is probably too much. Realize that you're going to want to start at this big global level first, and then you kind of get down to the local level. If you look at that big picture first, that could be the hardest part to see because you can be too close to it. So sometimes you want a second pair of eyes on it. One of the reasons, as I mentioned, that you don't want to get down too far into the details, when you make these global changes, you might end up taking whole sections out. So if you get too caught up in making little small nitpicky changes, they might just be wasted time. The last part is going to be when you're looking at the grammar, spelling, and punctuation. Global filters, this is something I learned from one of my University of Iowa classes. It was a really helpful class called The Art of Revision for Clarity. So it's ideal to do this objective bird's eye view and some questions to ask yourself after you've finished your draft, think about what is that overarching point of the story. And you want to make sure that all of the smaller points are going to feed into that point, and make sure one of the things we struggle with, particularly as memoirists, can also happen in fiction, where you have an idea in your head, you know what you want to say. One of our members said that she had shared a draft with someone that she respected. The person said, well, I just don't really understand the motivation of this character. She told her what she was feeling from reading it. And then the author said, oh gosh, well, no, the character she's got this complex background, and you see she's had this happen to her in her life previously. And then she realized that she actually had never written any of that. It was all in her head. So she knew the characters, but she just didn't realize that she hadn't gotten that idea out from what she thought the character was, to put that down onto the paper. So that's something that you really want to be aware of. Think about whether there are any parts that are missing. Likewise, you want to make sure that you don't have too much. You don't have some unnecessary pieces. You don't want info dumps or exposition. And you want to have each scene moving that story forward. Thinking about your structure, you want to make sure that the beginning particularly is really compelling, because that's really important to grab your readers and keep them reading. Kurt Vonnegut had the advice of starting as close to the ending as possible. This doesn't work with every story, but it's something to play with. By having the ending kind of at the beginning, then it gives you the reader a preview of what is going to happen and gives them some emotional buy-in to keep going. And then you can go, after that first chapter, you can go back to the beginning of the story. So that's just one option that you might look at. Jessica shared something recently that she uses for editing that was really thought-provoking. She actually, before rereading her draft, she will write down a summary of key points for each chapter or major event in the book. You might use note cards so that you can move them around later if you'd like. And then you reread the draft and compare that list to that summary that you just wrote. Or if you use Scrivener like I do, I use the synopsis feature. And as I'm going, I actually make a little summary, like a 1 or 2 sentence summary of the chapter. And so that way I wouldn't even need to reread the whole thing. I could just do a comparison between the summary that I did without rereading, and then the actual draft that I have. What you want to do is look for key points in the draft that you forgot to include in step 1 in that summary. If you forgot to write it down there, you might consider removing it, because if it wasn't important enough to the story for you to remember it when you're writing it down in your summary, you might not need it. It might be actually stronger without it. Likewise, you want to make sure on the converse, if you have written something down in your summary, but you don't see it there in the actual draft, you want to make sure that could be a case where that inner word hasn't made it to the page. And so consider whether you want to add or strengthen pieces to the story. And also you might notice that the summary that you just came up with is in a different order than what you actually did in your draft. And it might actually make more sense to have a more logical flow. This just gives you a lot of options to really look at your story a different way and see if you make some changes at this high level like this. Something that is really nice is to print that draft. It just feels really great to see your actual manuscript in print. Sometimes when we have something on the screen, our eyes have a tendency to just skip over things, and our brain fills in the blanks with the things that we expect to be there and miss out on some of those errors. And also you have fewer distractions if you have a printed copy. We don't have a bunch of tabs open if you have a print in front of you. Take notes on things like pacing, character development, plot holes, that sort of thing, and use these. I find that these tabs, these little flags like this, can be really helpful to identify places you need to come back. Triage. You want to make sure you fix the big stuff first before you dive in. So you're going to be looking at character arcs, point of view, identifying essential or non-essential scenes, looking at the pacing, where things are moving too slow or where you've left things out, and that logical, compelling order of events. Another thing you might do, if you have a piece that has a lot of sub-stories or characters that have individual side quests or something like this, you might want to analyze all those sub-stories and characters individually. That way you can ensure that the themes are cohesive and consistent, and that they show your intended story arc. By taking that out of the rest and looking at it individually, you can really see if your character development is fully developed. And You can see if your character's voice remains consistent, if their hair color remains consistent, that sort of thing. And if it does change, you want to make sure that it's due to growth or something that you intended to put there and it's not just an accident. And this could also be a part where you prune or add to your piece, if to your sub stories, if you have one character that ended up being too weak, or one part of your story that doesn't really seem to have enough going for it. By taking it out separately, you can really make sure that you've got a good balance. Scrivener, again, I don't get paid by Scrivener or anything, but I just think it's a really great tool. And you can actually go and like make tags and different ways so that you can actually pretty quickly highlight what scenes have different characters. And it's a pretty cheap tool. And it's just, I find it for bigger pieces, especially, it's really, really helpful. Now it's time to get in the nitty gritty, local filters. Once you've looked at the overall and you've made your changes, you want to make sure that each individual sentence and paragraph and chapter gets us closer to the whole, to that arc, to that narrative that you're trying to get across. You want to ensure that each chapter feeds into that whole story arc, and that each paragraph supports the chapter, and then each sentence feeds into the paragraph. You also are going to look at like your transitions between scenes to make sure that we don't have jarring jumps between them. It's fine to do that between chapters or something like that. But if you're inside of a chapter, transition sentences, one transition sentence even can be really helpful just to make the flow work well. And this is something that I've really noticed in my own writing has been really helpful for me lately, is those transitions can do a lot of the heavy lifting to connect your story, to really get that inner word out there on the paper. So pay attention to that. Remember that each prose piece is like a journey. It should have a beginning, it should have a middle, and an end. You want to avoid redundancy. If two scenes or even two paragraphs or two sentences are showing one aspect of a character or one event, making the same point more than once, axe one of them, merge them. This was something I really learned in that class that I was mentioning earlier, is I had a tendency to think that by adding more descriptions to something that I was making it more emotionally charged. And I found it's kind of counterintuitive, but I found that by taking out the extra pieces, it actually made the impact so much stronger. So just try that. Stephen King recommends that you should plan on cutting at least 10% of your word count from your first draft. You've probably heard this quote where he said, kill your darlings, even when it breaks your egocentric little scribbler's heart, kill your darlings. So he's talking about those. Sometimes we're really attached to a certain turn of phrase or a certain scene. But when you look at that, the paragraph that you're in, the chapter that you're in, and really analyze whether you're just infatuated with this wording, whether it really is adding to the story or not. A lot of times those pieces that you're really attached to, they might be pretty, but they're not really supporting the story. And so you have to make the cut and take those out. One thing that really drives me crazy when I'm reading something is info dumps. Probably heard them called exposition. That's kind of like a lazy way of getting a lot of information out to the reader. Notoriously, you'll find them at the beginning of the story, and that's when it's most critical to hook in your reader. Many times you can actually take out like the first paragraph, the first page even. It's really nice to leave things to be discovered later. That can be an effective way to hook your reader in and keep them reading and keep them wanting to know. You have to get the balance right. You don't want them to be lost. But here's like an example. An info dump will often just sound stilted and unnatural if you're trying to force the reader to get some information across. Here's some dialogue. As you know, Mary, we met in Chicago 4 years ago. Our lives sure have changed since then. Simply changing around the order could make this sound more natural. I'd say, can you believe how much has changed since we met at that crappy sports bar in Chicago? And so by just changing the wording around and making it more specific, now you're getting more information to your reader and it's sounding more natural. And please, for the love of God, don't do something like this last piece here. Hello, Bob, my mother's boyfriend. Welcome to my home that I share with my roommate, Stephanie, and our cats. It's just a lazy, clunky way of getting information about characters, seeing a backstory into your writing, and it really jars the reader out of the experience and reminds them that they're reading your book instead of experiencing it. So that's why it's really so important that you take care of your details, especially you see this in sci-fi and fantasy a lot, because you're trying to build this complex world that we don't have our own day-to-day knowledge of already. You can still get that information across, but just make sure that you're sprinkling it throughout instead of dumping it all in big piece. Some signs of info dumps: if the text is something that you as the author want to say instead of something that your characters want to add to the story, it's something that they would want to say or do, that could be a sign of an info dump. If they go into a long explanation of why they did something, you could do a search time. You say, as you know, or you might remember. You can do some of this, but these are notorious words, phrases that would indicate that you're getting ready to do some exposition. It will lack an emotional response. It'll just irritate your reader, and it just makes it feel unnatural. Ludmila asked, how about including the backstory at the beginning? Yeah, you can do that as long as it seems it's something that the characters would want to get across. Use a light hand with this. If it's just pages of history, it can really be boring for the reader.
Actually, writing a memoir, and the first scene would say, okay, we arrive in Berlin. And then just after the first scene, I tell like how we got there, like why we are here.
Mm-hmm.
And I dump all the information there, as in, okay, how it started and how we got there. Would that be something to avoid?
It depends. I mean, it can work. I think with memoir, it is a little different. You can get away with doing more, especially if you're using first person and you're saying, I arrived in Berlin and here's how I got here. And you could even do that, even if it's fiction, by using first person. I think you have a little more freedom. Make sure that it's really important for the reader to know it right away. You don't want to give away too much too fast.
I think I'll get it read by some to have a second opinion and see what the reader feels. Thank you.
Yeah, question. Thank you. Point of view is also could be known as vantage point. 4 primary points of view that you can use. And it's fine to use any of these, but you just make sure that you realize that the point of view colors everything in your story. And it's really important to make sure that it's consistent throughout. You don't want to change your point of view, especially partially like halfway through a chapter or something like that. It could threaten your reader's trust, risk damaging the architecture of your story, and it just really has a jarring effect on the reader. You can definitely get multiple characters' points of view out there. You might see a lot of times you'll see a story that has each chapter told by a different person. That's totally fine. Just make sure that you're not switching around, jumping between people's heads within a chapter. First person is when you're going to be using I, me, my, and that's where the story is told from the viewpoint of the narrator, and everything that happens is colored by their own interpretation and experiences and their own voice. It's biased and incomplete. That's not necessarily a bad thing. You are in the head of the person who's telling the story. Second person is something kind of unusual, where it's almost like a dialogue between the author and the reader. That's when they're using you and your, and you kind of becomes the protagonist. It's uncommon in fiction and in memoir, to be honest. Can make the story more personal and engaging. You might see this more in like, inspirational books or something like that. Third person omniscient is with he, she, him, her, they, their. That's when the narrator has full access to all the thoughts and experiences of all the characters in the story. But the most common one that's used in fiction is third person limited. He, she, him, her, they, their again. But this is where the narrator has limited access to the thoughts and experiences of the characters in the story. And often it's just one character that is revealing their story at a time. You can also keep in mind that you can reveal other points of view, or other characters express their point of view through dialogue. One of the things that was recommended in this class that I took was to read through the entire piece and ensure your point of view remains consistent throughout, so you're not getting bogged down in other types of revision as you're doing this. And you want to make sure you're going beyond just I, you, he, she, they. You're not just looking at the pronouns. You need to be asking yourself, should the narrator have access to this knowledge that's being described in this scene? Are the reflections consistent with the character's voice? Are they recognizing the same sort of things throughout your story? Is that tone remaining consistent? And if not, why? Is it intentional or is it accidental? And another thing to look at is a lot of times in stories I've read, you'll find that the narrator is actually dodging the most interesting parts of the story. So just keep an eye out for these things. Point of view problems are among the most common mistakes that writers make when they first are getting started. Another really big one is verb tense. Again, you need to make sure you're using them with intention. So you want to read through the entire piece again, if you can. If it's a really long book, I know you might be able to do a couple of these at once. You want to ensure that the verb tense remains consistent throughout. That's not to say you're not going to use a variety of tenses, particularly with dialogue. You're going to be using present tense, and then with your narrative, you might be using past tense. Past tense is the easiest and most commonly used verb tense. Present tense is said to create tension and a sense of urgency, but it can be really difficult to stick to if you're trying to do any flashbacks or anything. It gets tricky quick. Not to say you can't use it, but just keep that in mind. Ursula Le Guin said that it's highly probable that if you go back and forth between past and present tense, if you switch the tense of your narrative frequently and without some kind of signal, a line break, a dingbat, a new chapter, something, your reader will get all mixed up as to what happened before what, and what's happening after which, where we are, when we are at the moment. So it's just really important to make sure that your verb tense is consistent. Another piece to look at is passive voice versus active voice. This is something that editors and instructors often advise against using passive voice too much because it can feel awkward if it's overused, and it just kind of takes the urgency and pacing away when you use too much passive voice. So active voice is going to be conveying direct action and strength. Example here, you're going to have a subject, then a verb, then an object. So Jenny is the subject, loves is the verb, and pizza. Jenny loves pizza. Pizza is the object. You could also sometimes have an implied object. For example, Jenny sat. You know that she's sitting down on a chair. The passive voice conveys submissiveness and subtlety. So that's going to be where you have the object first, then the verb, then the subject. So pizza is loved by Jenny. The reason why I have this picture of the zombie over here is because if you add the words by zombies to the end of your sentence, if it still makes sense, that means that it's in passive voice. So you can see pizza is loved by Jenny and by zombies. If the object is your desired focus, like in this last case, the chair is the important part of this sentence, that's totally fine to use passive voice. If you don't know who made the action, passive voice is going to make sense in that time as well. So there's nothing wrong with using it, but you just want to make sure you're mixing it up. If you want to have the action, the pacing be quicker, it's best to use the active voice instead of passive voice. A lot of times, passive voice will be indicated by the word by. So if you want to use the find tool, you can look for the word by, and that will, if you find it, most likely it's going to be in passive voice, and just switching around the object and the subject can sometimes really improve your sentences. Weasel words. Weasels are cute, and these words seem cute and harmless, but they're kind of like using the word or something like that in your speech. I have this ridiculous sentence to give you an example, but usually when you add one, really just ask yourself if it is actually adding anything or if it's simply making your writing somewhat somehow mushy, maybe. You see, there's just too many extra words in here, and we each have our own weasel words that we use. Mine is somehow. Too many weasel words make your writing mushy, and just slow it down. Most of the time, if you find any of these words in your writing, taking it out is often going to make it a better sentence. Bloat words are similar. So these are words that are going to just make the writing have extra words and slow things down without really adding to it. So however, anytime you see the word however, likely not going to be needed. So it's not that this is a bad sentence. He liked to write, however, he hated editing. You could just say he liked to write, but hated editing. It's just more concise. And started and began are something, those are pet peeves of mine. If you say Alex started to approach his professor, Alex started to climb the tree, unless there is something really important about the reason why he's getting started, or if he started and then he had to stop, started just slows it down. It doesn't add anything. So it's much more concise and clear to just say Alex approached his professor. Up and down, these words are also kind of bloat words. You could just say, instead of saying he stood up, you can just say he stood. As well as is also kind of unnecessary. She liked cats as well as books. Or you could just say she liked cats and books. Saying less is actually a lot of times more. We have a really nice quote here from Janet Ivanovich. She said, I strongly believe in reduction writing. It's like reduction in cooking. When you make gravy, you take a big pot of ingredients, meat, spices, and you boil it down to a little pot of stuff, which is the essence. If you use that principle in writing, you're getting 2 terrific sentences rather than 4 long, tedious paragraphs. This last sentence here, I thought that by adding these extra adjectives, it was creating more sympathy or something, but it actually makes a boring sentence. It would be better just to take out some of those extra words, and it has a lot more impact. Here's another example. Sally's visit was unexpected and surprising. Well, surprises are always unexpected, so you don't need to say both. Specificity versus generality. This is something that really can take a piece and really make it sparkle. Readers are greedy animals, and if you have to ensure that their cage is big enough, but if you give them too much space to put in their own ideas, they will. And so they're going to be imagining you're trying to describe some Christmas lights. And if you don't say what color they are, whatever, they're going to be putting in what they have in their mind of what they, when they think of Christmas lights. You want to avoid points where your inner word is obliterated by the lack of clarity in your outer word. Watching for generalities when a character or scene could be described as stereotypical or normal, you want to make sure that normality isn't what we're looking for. And when we read, we want something poignant, we want something special. And by adding specificity, that can really do that for you. So some ambiguous words that would indicate some generality. If you say thing, stuff, good, bad, pretty, ugly, beautiful, unique, these words don't really have any meaning. They're just general and bland. If we take this example here, cutting down all those beautiful old trees really changed the appearance of the landscape. It's not a bad sentence, but look at this if you add some specificity. In 2 weeks, the loggers transformed a 10,000-acre forest of old-growth redwood, red and white pine into a field of ruts and stubble. Immediately, we have such a more clear, compelling view of this world by adding of the red and white pine, 1,000-acre forest, and then the field of ruts and stubble. We've got this real nice image now. And if you can use double duty descriptions, really great to do that if you can. Here's a really good example from Alice Munro. Her teeth were crowded to the front of her mouth as if they were ready for an argument. So we're getting not only a description of what she looks like, what her teeth looks like, we're also seeing a little bit about her personality. We're seeing that she's a fighter, that she's looking for arguments all the time. So double duty descriptions. Adverbs are something that it's fine to use some of them. Stephen King has a really nice quote here. The road to hell is paved with adverbs. I think that's a little harsh, but bear with me. He says, to put it another way, they're like dandelions. If you have one in your lawn, it's pretty and unique. But if you have a lawn full of dandelions or a book full of adverbs, it's just ugly. It just is cumbersome and redundant. Here's an example of these adverbs that really don't need to be here. Put it down, she shouted menacingly. Give it back, he pleaded objectively. It's mine. Don't be such a fool, Jekyll, Utterson said contemptuously. You could just take out all of these adverbs and it would cleaner and wouldn't be so clunky. Adverbs usually end in ly. So again, if you use the find key, the find shortcut, or go to edit and find and just search for ly, that's a quick way of finding adverbs. It's fine to use some of them, just don't overuse them close proximity to each other. You really don't need to say, like, if you've got whispered, you don't need to say quietly. We all know that it's going to be quiet. And if somebody's yelling, we know it's going to be loud. Just take out the loudly, and sobbing defeatedly doesn't really add anything. You really should try to avoid dense, rambling sentences. Do you remember diagramming sentences back in school where you take your object and your subject and the adjectives, and you line them all out. I'll line them all out like this. This is a pretty dense sentence here. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. Or you could just say, Gregor Samsa awoke to find himself transformed into a monster. If you need a master's degree to diagram your sentences, you might be rambling. You might have too much information in there. Find the subject and the action, the subject and the verb. And what I do is find those two and take out as many of the extra adjectives and adverbs and everything. And often I find that I've got a better sentence by taking out these extra pieces. Obviously, you want to check for spelling mistakes. Every writing application has spell check. Please use it. The find and replace tool is such a powerful tool. If you make the same mistake again and again, you can use edit, find, replace, that's the Control H on the PC is the shortcut for that, and correct them all at one go. If, like me, you were taught when you were learning to write that you should have two spaces after a period or after a colon, my fingers still want to put in two spaces. That's not the way we're supposed to write now. New guidance is it should just be one. So if you just do Control H and do find two spaces, type two spaces, and then put replace with just one, that'll just take care of all of them in one fell swoop. We can also use that find tool, like we mentioned a bit ago, to find our adverbs by searching for ly, or we can find passive voice by searching for by. And another thing, if we see -ing words, that often is going to weaken your prose. So if we have this example here, Abigail was walking along the bike trail. There was a boy riding his bike. He was smiling up at her as she passed. She started wondering what the boy was so happy about. It's not terrible, but it's just so much more concise if we just say, Abigail walked along the bike trail. A boy rode his bike and smiled as he passed her. She wondered what the boy was so happy about. We get to the point a lot faster, more concise, ramps up that pace. Dialogue tags should be like punctuation marks. They should guide the reader without calling attention to themselves. You really only need to use them when they're actually needed. Have some faith in the readers. You can just use said and asked. Those are the most unobtrusive options. You can say shouted, whispered, mumbled, but only do it when the character really is shouting, mumbling, or whispering, and not just because you're tired of saying said or asked. You can let the characters use each other's names, but you don't want to do it too much or else it gets unrealistic. I think you should really avoid using adverbs with dialogue text. You're telling the reader what to think instead of showing them. So an example here is, my mom has cancer, he said sadly. Or you could just say, my mom has cancer, he said, not meeting Jenny's eyes. That gives you a little information on what is happening, a visual of this dialogue. And we know that he's sad because he's not meeting her eyes. Dialogue action beats are typically standalone sentences that break up the dialogue, indicate who's speaking. They reveal details about the characters. Too many of them draw attention to themselves and take the reader out of the experience. So again, it's about getting the right balance. But you can really use these to reveal emotion with body language. So for example, Josh tapped his fingers on the table. Tell me again where you were last night. You can reveal scenery and setting. I just don't know. Jenny gazed at the smoldering ruins of the home. Oh, and one quick note here. Since this is Jenny gazing, it should be on the same line. The next action by another character should be on the next line. You can also reveal character traits and relationships through dialogue action beats. I like what you've done with your hair. Josh twirled a finger through a chin-length auburn curl. Use your action beats instead of a tag, not in addition to it. Read it and weep, she said, dropping the letter on Josh's lap. It's okay, but you can just take it out and we get the same effect, but more concise. Read it and weep. She dropped the letter on Josh's lap. I cannot stress enough how much reading your piece out loud can really highlight problems. It's one of the best tools you have in your writer's toolbox. When you read it silently, your brain fools your eyes into reading things that are not there. You can also use naturalreaders.com or the text-to-speech function with Word or Google Docs. It's under accessibility options. And that can really, by having it read in another voice, can really highlight problems. We also have in the Happy Writing community every other Monday night at 8:30 p.m. Munich time, we have reading out loud, or if you're writing memoir or personal essay, please come and join us on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Some other tricks you might use to find issues is to let it rest between editing sessions. If you're looking at something too long, you get lost in those words. Also, just reading one page and then looking away. When you look back, your eyes can focus in. Something about refocusing can really highlight problems. Changing the font. I know this is such a terrible font, but Comic Sans, like for some reason, if you put something in Comic Sans, it's a lot easier to find the errors. And it also, I've heard that it helps with writer's block. Google Docs and Word both include tools that highlight basic grammar problems, but both tend to identify different issues. So sometimes what I will do is copy and paste my text between the two so I can see what the squiggly lines show me. We're here to help the community. If you're facing a challenge, chances are someone else has been there and they can offer a sympathetic ear or helping hand. meetings Mondays, Wednesdays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays. And Memoir Mentors meets on Thursdays. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I guess we're already at the end. So with that, I'm going to wish you all good luck on making that beautiful mess into something that you feel proud of, something you can share. And I hope that you've got some good tools. If you do reach a point where you need professional editing services, I have a freelance company at penyourmasterpiece.com. I hope to see you all again sometime really soon in our community online or in person. Good luck. Happy writing.